The day has finally come where I can talk about my favorite superhero of all time as directed by my favorite director of all time. Today is the day where I talk about Batman Begins. The origin story of Batman sees Bruce Wayne returning to a crime-ridden Gotham to fight injustice after training with his mentors Henri Ducard and Ra's al Ghul. Now, as we've established, I am very excited to give you my review for Batman Begins, but I want you to start the conversation first in the comments below. Feel free to talk about spoilers. It's been 17 years since this film was released. I am old. And if you like movies and TV, this is the place to be, so consider clicking that subscribe button so you don't miss any future conversation on your favorite movies and TV. If you followed me for any period of time, you will know Batman Begins is one of my favorite movies of all time. Number 1, Batman is my favorite superhero of all time. Number 2, Christopher Nolan is my favorite director of all time. But number 3, and perhaps most importantly, this is the film that when I saw it back in 2005, little 12-year-old me saw it and thought, I want to be a film director. And that is not just because I love this character and I already went into this film excited, it's because this film has such a unique, fresh, and relatable interpretation of the Caped Crusader. Christopher Nolan was able to pick this character and kind of insert him into the real world, where he treats this film as this kind of mystery drama crime thriller first, and it just so happens to have Batman in it. Furthermore, this is my favorite type of superhero story. I know it's unpopular, but I love origin stories. I love stories about people becoming the better version of themselves, and this film does an origin story right, where everything connects. Everything that sent our hero on the path that they're on is all connected, and everything bleeds and feeds into the other elements. This might just be my favorite single origin story put into film. Not only because we have great performances, great direction, a fantastic screenplay with astonishing cinematography, and a score that is to die for that I will get to later, but this film is thematically rich. Where the entire Dark Knight trilogy in itself has each film with its own unique theme, this film is about fear, and that kind of molds this origin story into also being a coming of age, as we see Bruce Wayne through several steps in his life. We see him as a kid, and we see the Waynes dying, which at this point in 2022 has kind of become a joke, but this was actually the first time, the proper first time, we had a fleshed out Batman origin story on screen. And so we get to go with Bruce Wayne through all the important stages of his life, where he is a kid, and when he's an adult, he goes and tries to kill Carmine Falcone, where he's this naive young adult that doesn't really understand the dangers and the power structure of his city. And then we see him becoming the man, the ninja per se, that eventually becomes Batman, which, as a Batman aficionado, I love seeing the League of Shadows in here. And I love how the League of Shadows feeds into the thematic nature of the film, where Bruce Wayne is running away from his fear, but through the League of Shadows, which in context is a bad thing, they're bad guys, but Bruce Wayne through them learns to use his fear to incite fear in others. They're the ones that kind of start to introduce him the ideas that he will mold and refine to become the Batman. And I quite like the training sessions and the relationship that he develops through one of his father figures, that is Henri Ducard. Let's call him Henri Ducard for now, played by Liam Neeson. This is like one of the last great roles of Liam Neeson, where he has this kind of nurturing, human, compelling relationship with Bruce and bond that they form, but through the film, as you look back on their relationship, how it started, certain lines that he gave to Bruce, they start to take on this whole new, different meaning that I love. Because they just present this whole new dynamic when you look back on the entire film, and even when you go back to rewatch this film. And the film is not just worried at creating the Batman through the journey of Bruce Wayne. We see both sides of the character, and that's what makes this film such a rich, compelling character study. Because little by little, as Bruce is trying to save his city, by embracing this persona of the Batman that he's creating, and we see him creating little by little with all the gadgets and finding the cave and refining the suit, we see Bruce Wayne himself being lost a little bit more each time he has a new advancement, he learns something new as the Batman. Bruce Wayne loses a little bit of his identity. And that's the dichotomy that makes and has made the Batman such an interesting character. To the point where Christian Bale has to play on so many levels in this film. He has to play Bruce Wayne as Bruce Wayne, who's trying to find himself, who's trying to protect the city, who's trying to pretend he's not this Batman fella that just showed up. He has to play the Batman who is growing and molding himself into the caped crusader that we know he will become, that we know and love. And he has to play the phony, fake Bruce Wayne that has to be so antagonistic to everyone around him and keep everyone at bay, to the point where he ruins certain important relationships with the other aristocrats of Gotham. All the while, this same Bruce Wayne that is giving this face to the people has to try and win his company back, all the while trying to maintain his identity a secret. It's such a complex level of a performance and of a character study written on the page that they so beautifully incorporated into their story and into their narrative of this fantastic origin story. And I love the Batman sequences in this film as well, where it feels like a horror film. Every time Batman shows up, particularly in the first and second acts, it's like we're seeing a horror film from the perspective of the goons that he is catching. And when he catches Falcone, that entire sequence where we barely see Batman, where we're on the side of almost of the goons and they're all being picked apart and jumped on by this monster. And then at the end, we have the introduction.
What the hell are you? I'm Batman.
And this may be an unpopular opinion, but I have always loved the Batman voice. I love it. I love hearing it. I love doing it. I'm Batman. That's intimidating. I don't care where you're from. What I also love that we start seeing here as Batman is more becoming who he's meant to be, and as he starts to understand what is he failing at, what does he still have to learn, and we see him little by little working the kinks of this persona and working on his mistakes as he eventually confronts Scarecrow and he's caught with a fear gas, and the next time he comes back, he's already prepared for that eventuality. So we see Batman literally learning on the job, which makes him extremely compelling. He's not suddenly this perfect superhero who already knows everything that he has to do, already knows everything about his enemies. He's learning as he goes, and each confrontation is a teachable moment. And I really love the inclusion of Cillian Murphy's Jonathan Crane, aka Scarecrow, because he works so well as a red herring. And it makes Gotham feel like this living organism with all these moving pieces that at first seemed like everything and there's just too much happening. But by the end of the film, it was all so intricately connected and every piece made their necessary movements as we eventually learn that Scarecrow was working for Ra's al Ghul, who turns out was Liam Neeson's character all along. I've always thought this was a great twist, and the lessons that he taught Bruce Wayne come back to haunt him. So that fear that he opened up to this man, this father figure, tears him down, tears the foundations of who he is, of his family down, only for Alfred to pick him back up. And I haven't talked enough about Alfred, but their whole relationship throughout this film is amazing. I love Michael Caine as Alfred. I love his dynamic with Bruce. I think they have such underrated chemistry on screen. This is my favorite Alfred. I just love the banter that he has. I love that he's not afraid to say anything to Bruce whatsoever. And it just delivers some nice little humor, some nice levity here and there for such a heavy, dramatic film. And a film as dramatic, as intense as it is, it has such an engaging mystery, as every time Batman seems to be one step ahead of its villains and he's taken care of the problem, quote unquote, turns out the problem is still happening. So what is actually going on? I also love, like we talked about, that as Batman is learning on the job, the movie just doesn't let Batman become the hero. Batman needs help, and Batman leverages his help as he starts to form this relationship with Commissioner Gordon, played by Gary Oldman. Also, again, I know I'm saying this a lot about the characters in this version or in this trilogy's version of the films, but this is my Commissioner Gordon. Gary Oldman is such perfect casting for this role. I love how he's afraid of Batman at first, how little by little he starts to see that, I need to trust this guy, because clearly everything else is very corrupt. I love that he gets to ride the tumbler and shoot the bridge down at the end. Just a great dynamic that is generated. And again, another fatherly figure for the Batman to mold himself and his sense of justice. Where we have one fatherly figure that turns out is one of the bad guys, we start to have something that balances it out with two fatherly figures that are the purest of pure souls. And those two fatherly figures play such important, vital roles in the eventual takedown of Ra's al Ghul and the eventual victory, first big victory for the Batman. I just love how we worked throughout this entire film to connect the dots, even going back to when Bruce's parents died, and the path he took on from then was always meant to bring him to this point. The score as well is fantastic, and it's such a fundamental part of the identity of this film and of what the franchise would become, where all the recognizable themes and tracks by Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, who is kind of a forgotten hero as far as the score of this franchise is concerned, they construct this so well, where everything just starts to build throughout the film, and we get the Batman theme that we know from these movies only at the end. As a score guy, I've always fallen in love with how this score is constructed. And a really interesting fact is that each track is named after a species of bat. And like I said, this film does origin story in such a clever way, but it also ends so incredibly well, where yes, it will do the job of getting you pumped up for the sequel, but that final scene, that final meeting between Gordon and Batman, where he says, "I never thanked you," and Batman says, "You'll never have to." See, I love doing the Batman voice. It's not only a great way to set us off for that sequel with that Joker card that is so exciting, but it caps off and brings full circle the relationship that was initiated, that was rocky at the beginning, and was developed and nurtured throughout this film with that fatherly kind of relationship that is set off from the beginning, from Gordon giving in the blanket, saying everything is going to be okay, and now they're partners and they're fighting injustice to save their city, the city that they love, where Batman became something more than Bruce Wayne. He's not only the company man, he's not trying to save just his father's legacy, he's trying to save this city, the city that took away his parents from him. And thematically, narratively, that is rich, that is compelling, and it just encapsulates basically everything that I love about this movie. Something that I love how Nolan frames the becoming of Batman is that this came from very bad reasons. This came from very bad reasoning on Bruce's part. Everything about becoming the Batman is taken away from him until he decides to balance both by the end, when he tells Rachel who he is by quoting the phrase she gave once to him. And speaking of Rachel, this now is where I go into my issues and drawbacks. As much as I love Batman Begins, I never thought Katie Holmes was a particularly good actress. I don't think she does a particular good job in this film. Bigger than that, however, is I don't really care about the Bruce-Rachel relationship. I understand their dynamic, I understand her importance to him, but I never really cared if they end up together. I see her as being there in these key moments for Bruce's development, as he's kind of losing himself like we talked about throughout the film, and she gives this one line to him that reshifts his focus and gives him a new perspective. I think that's important. When he saves her from the fear gas from Scarecrow and takes her on the tumbler, there's this amazing chase scene where you see Bruce Wayne taking over the Batman persona, where Batman has all these rules, all these regulations. I won't kill, I won't hurt many people unless I ultimately have to, unless I have no other choice. But when he has to save Rachel, nothing else matters. He blows roofs, he goes over police cars, he'll get everything and everyone out of the way just as long as it means he can save Rachel. I love that on Bruce's part, but I still never cared too much for this character of Rachel in particular. Spoiler alert, I don't care for her here, I don't care for her in the next movie either. The biggest issue is really that she never felt like a proper character, more like a plot device that is there at key moments for other characters. Another issue, as much as it pains me to say, is that the fight sequences in this film are not that good. In the beginning, when Bruce is training, you can actually see a lot of the choreography that went into it. There are a lot of wide shots, there are not too many cuts, but the more the film goes on, up until the end where he fights Ra's al Ghul on the train, it becomes this constant close-up, quick cut sequence that seems like it was chopped to death. The bigger problem with this is we know for a fact they had a ton of important choreography going behind the scenes. We can see that choreography early in the film, but later on we can't. I understand, obviously, that it's hard for someone to move in that Batman suit. I understand, obviously, that even at the time, Liam Neeson was no spring chicken, and so it was probably not viable for him to do a ton of choreographed action on screen. Nolan wanted to dive away from that sort of highly choreographed dance-like action that had come into fruition in the early 2000s. He wanted this more of brutal brawler style that I think fits so well with the Batman, and Christian Bale certainly looks the part. This is a big, brawly, meaty Batman in this film. Now when we can see him fight, it really works, but it feels like the more the film goes on, the less we can see those qualities shine through. But ultimately, Batman Begins is the kind of story I love the most, told in the most unique way possible, that is clearly and solely Christopher Nolan's. He was able to pick up this superhero that was in ruins. His name meant nothing at the time after some of the Schumacher films and was able to bring him back to his former glory. Batman Begins is to me the quintessential superhero origin story and the quintessential Batman movie, if I'm honest, where they found new ways to explore Bruce's psyche that make him interesting, compelling, relatable. It's a smart, gritty, brooding character study and an astonishing start to a brand new resurgence of a legendary character. I'm giving Batman Begins an A. Those are my thoughts on Batman Begins, but I want to hear what you think about it, so start the conversation in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you like what you saw here, click that subscribe button so you won't miss any future conversation on your favorite movies and TV. Thank you so much to my channel members Brunette and Stuart for making this video possible. There's a link in the description for you to see if you want to become a member, and I'll be back very soon with reviews for the next 2 Christopher Nolan Batman movies, The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. I hope to see you on those, and so until then, love each other and love the movies.